The next speaker is Hank Greeley, Professor of Law at Stanford University. Professor Greeley is interested in a variety of ethical and legal issues that arise around biology and neuroscience. He's chair of the California Advisory Committee on Human Stem Cell Research, and he was formerly co-director of the Law and Neuroscience Project sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation, and he'll provide us with an overview of neuroscience's relevance to the law.
Okay. And there's my PowerPoint presentation. I have a sort of daunting task here. I have 30 minutes to tell you something that I spend an entire term in a 3-hour-a-week seminar trying to begin to scratch the surface of, and that is the ways in which I think neuroscience will end up affecting the law. The bottom line for me is I think it will affect it in lots of ways. I don't think it will completely revolutionize it top to bottom, but I think there will be a number of very substantial and important ways in which neuroscience will have a significant effect on the law. That is because of the truly amazing scientific revolution going on right now in neuroscience. Like most scientific revolutions, I think it's largely a revolution caused by new tools. Some of those tools are physical, like MRI machines. Some of them are conceptual, like machine learning algorithms to do statistical analysis of results. But the answer is, the result is, that really compared to 30 years ago, we know close to infinitely more now than we did then about how the brain works. And compared to 30 years from now, we probably will look back and say we knew almost nothing about how the brain works. That's probably also true of the human liver. But I don't think the revolution in liver science is going to have a big effect on the law. It has some maybe little effects on alcoholism laws, but it won't be a big deal because the brain is not just any other organ. The brain is the organ that creates our minds, that creates our behaviors, and it is behaviors and minds that law cares about, much more than it cares about bodies. So even though most of this revolution in neuroscience is being driven by medical funding and medical interests and focused on health, the spin-off effects, because it gives us greater understanding about human brains, minds, and behaviors, will be enormous in the law, much greater than Teflon and Tang, the two greatest spin-off effects of the space program. So I want to say two preliminary things before getting into the meat of my topic. The first is, I think there are three broad ways we can think about neuroscience influencing law. One is it will change legal processes themselves. Neuroscience will have some effects in courtrooms, in police stations, in investigations, and so on. Second, it will change some of the subjects of the law. New neuroscience information will lead to new social and popular concerns, which will lead to new statutes, new kinds of lawsuits being brought, new things for law to act on. And third, maybe in the long run most importantly, but the hardest to get your hands around, is that neuroscience may change our society or our societies' cultures in ways that will ultimately have consequences for the law that is created by and helps create those cultures. So it works on a number of different levels. Second preliminary thing, I think very important, and I had this kicked into me in a nice conversation several years ago by Nick Rose. There are two important questions you've always got to keep in mind when looking at these new technologies in the law. One is, does it work? How well does it work? How do we know that it works? Does it work well enough to use at all? The second is, if it does work well enough to use at all, how should we use it? There is a danger here in getting too caught up in the second question before you've answered the first. There are now at least 5 different published papers, articles, about how fMRI-based lie detection would interact with the Fifth Amendment's privilege against self-incrimination, even though no court has ever yet accepted fMRI-based lie detection. So we've got to keep our eyes in two different directions. It's kind of like the offside rule in soccer where you've got to watch two different things at the same time. We've got to both worry about the present. Does it work now? How do we know whether it works now? How should we test whether it works now? How do we define how well is well enough? But we also have to worry about the future. if and when we decide it does work well enough, how do we want it to be used? With those preliminaries, I want to talk about 6 different topics, 6 different categories where I managed to shoehorn in just about everything I think is important in law and neuroscience. Other people will have other categorizations, and mine maybe don't always fit well, but they fit well enough, I think, for our purposes. And I now have 25 minutes to do it. The 6 things I want to talk about are: first, prediction; second, mind reading; third, responsibility; fourth, consciousness; fifth, treatment; and sixth and last, enhancement. Start with prediction. We predict things all the time. We predict them in a wide variety of ways. Stanford uses the SAT. Stanford Law School uses the LSAT to predict who's going to do well in school. My auto insurance company uses the fact that my son has totaled 3 cars to predict how much he's going to cost them and how much it's going to cost me in the future. They were none of them his fault, so he says. We predict all the time, and it is important, again, to remember that it's not like neuroscience will be suddenly the first way to predict something and there's never been any other way to predict something. And it's not like it will be the best way to predict something, even if it can predict something. It won't always be the best way. You might be able to look at a brain scan of someone and make some guess about how well they're going to do math, but you could probably get a better guess by giving them a math test and see how well they do math. So we have to remember that just because you can predict using a tool doesn't mean that that's the tool you want to use to do predictions, or that you use that tool alone. However, neuroscience, I think, will add predictive power in some ways, and I'll give you 3 examples. The first, the one I frankly find most personally scary, is I believe quite soon neuroscience tools will allow us to predict with a substantial degree of accuracy which 60-year-old, or even more frighteningly, 58-year-old, is going to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in the next 10 to 15 years, and which one isn't. Some combination of PET scans, of biomarkers taken from the cerebral spinal fluid, of biomarkers taken from the blood, of genetic analysis of the individual, of volumetric analyses of the brain, will combine to be able to let us know, yes, it's highly likely, 90% likely, you will get Alzheimer's disease in the next 10 or 15 years, or you will be diagnosed with it, or no, it's not. Now, I think this may actually be a nice example of the possible confounding of prediction and early diagnosis. I think one of the reasons this is probably true, will be true, is that Alzheimer's is not something that suddenly happens when you get diagnosed with it, but it's the end result of a process that's been going on for many years or perhaps many decades and has been leaving traces, although not symptomatic enough to be seen by behavioral characteristics, at least not strongly and clearly, but that show up in other ways. Well, what happens if we can predict who's going to get Alzheimer's disease? Health insurance might be interested. Ironically, if you use genetic methods to predict, health insurance in the United States, you Brits don't have to worry about this. Congratulations to you. Health insurance in the United States can't be denied you on the basis of your genetic information under GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, but there's no NINA, Neuroscience Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so although I couldn't take your APOE4 status and say, I'm not going to give you health insurance, a genetic trait, I might be able to take your PET scan and say, a lot of amyloid plaque there, I'm not going to give you health insurance. Health insurance, employment, long-term care insurance, the some people's hoped-for solution to the next big health crisis in the U.S., if we ever get past the acute care crisis, then my generation, the baby boomers aging, will bring on a long-term care crisis. There aren't a lot of good policy options for that. One people have hoped for is private long-term care insurance. But if you know you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, you're very likely to be interested in private long-term care insurance. And that makes you adverse selecting from the perspective of the insurance company, and this could actually, I think, kill the private long-term care insurance market. We had Judge Fletcher up here. Would a White House or maybe even a Senate committee be interested in which of their judges are likely, which of the people they're thinking of nominating to the bench are likely to get Alzheimer's disease? Maybe not for a district judge, maybe for a district judge. Almost certainly for a Supreme Court justice. And in fact, the Chief Judge of the Fourth Circuit recently stepped down at a very young age because she was developing early onset Alzheimer's disease. The administration that appointed her for the 4 or 5 years she served, longer than that, but the relatively short time she served, would probably have preferred to pick somebody who was going to serve longer. What about presidential candidates? We now ask for medical reports, some sort of medical reports on presidential candidates for them to give voluntarily. We have experience with an American president who had Alzheimer's disease, at least shortly after the end of his presidency, and I think probably showing some symptoms before the end of his presidency. Would we be interested in that? The test gives knowledge. Our society will be interested in that knowledge for many reasons. If that predictive knowledge can lead to a useful intervention, it's a wonderful thing. If we could use that to prevent Alzheimer's, it's a wonderful thing. It will be a wonderful thing because we will use that in part to do better research aimed at better interventions with respect to Alzheimer's. Better to do your research on people who you know are actually going to get the disease or are in the early stages of the disease. But just because it is made for that purpose doesn't mean it can't be used for other purposes. So this is an area where the law may end up becoming Alzheimer's testing, predictive testing may become a subject of the law. Might also, in a sense, actually show up in the legal process. There was a New York gangster who tried to get out of being tried on the grounds that he was demented with Alzheimer's disease. He'd wander around and mumble in his pajamas. I think the court ultimately concluded he wasn't. But to the extent you've got better neuroscience-based tests for Alzheimer's disease, that gets into the court process. 2 other predictive areas. Another one where it might become a subject of the law, predicting schizophrenia. Terrible, terrible disease. If I could fix only one disease, cure only one disease in the world, I might choose schizophrenia. It affects about 0.8% of the world's adult population. Incredibly disabling. And tragically, it typically strikes people in their late teens through their 20s. Just at the height of their promise, they are struck down. What if we could look at 12-year-olds and predict which ones are going to be schizophrenics, or 15-year-olds? How would our society use that information? How good would the prediction have to be? 99%? 90%? 80%? Before we'd use it. And if we would use it, would we use it to pick spots in college, law school, medical school, the police, the military? If we can answer the question, people will have ways they want to use that information, and we'll have to decide whether we want it to be used for those purposes. And then coming back to the processes of the law, predicting future dangerousness. You'll hear later in this conference about psychopathy and the possibility of using that to predict future dangerousness, predicted in terms of sentencing. In jurisdictions where judges have some sentencing discretion or have recently regained some sentencing discretion, that might be important. That might be a piece of evidence in addition to other evidence. Past behavior is always going to be a very important piece of evidence, but maybe neuroscience will add more evidence. And one can think of it being used even preemptively. The English, the British now have these antisocial conduct orders, or antisocial behavior orders, ASBOs. One can imagine a system that tried to intervene with people before they were guilty of anything, based on predictions about that they were going to be dangerous. That intervention might be lock them up and throw away the key, but it might also be try to give them some treatment, whatever that might be, warn the neighbors, put a GPS bracelet on them, a variety of different interventions. It's not all just do everything or do nothing, a variety of in-betweens. So those are some examples of prediction. There are others, but I need to move to mind reading. We are mind readers. I am reading your minds right now. I see the one person who's falling asleep. I see the people who look puzzled. I think that's what I see. I read minds by looking at faces, which is the way our species largely reads minds, faces, voices, body language, etc. Almost certainly, deeply, evolutionarily important to us because it's been a long time, I think, during which lions and tigers and bears haven't been the biggest threat to our existence, but other humans. And knowing whether this person is willing to share food with you or is about to beat you up is a really important thing. We read minds. If we can't read minds, it's deeply disabling. It's apparently one of the deficits of many people with autism, that they have difficulty understanding what other people are thinking, reading their minds. But of course we know we don't read minds all that well, or poker wouldn't exist, and dating would look a lot different, and the judicial process would look a lot different if we could read minds perfectly. We read them okay, but not perfectly. Maybe neuroscience can help us read them better. I think we're going to have some discussion later about neuroscience being used for lie detection. There are already 2 companies that are selling that service, and there have already been 2 court cases in the United States over the issue of whether that should be admissible as evidence. I'm not going to focus on that, but let me point out a couple of other mind-reading areas. Reading minds to tell whether somebody recognizes something they've seen before, whether it's something that, say an object from the crime scene or the picture of the crime scene itself. Both EEG methods and fMRI methods are being used to try to make these predictions. That could have some criminal law significance. Using mind reading to determine whether or not somebody is in pain. I think we're going to hear about this as well. For my own money, this is the big ticket item for the legal system, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of cases or disputes each year, most of them not the car accident kind of cases that you might think of, most of them Social Security disability cases, that turn on whether or not someone is in pain and how much pain they are in. If we could get a better test, if neuroscience could improve our ability to weed out those people who are truly in pain from those who are faking it, or even better, those who are grossly exaggerating it, that would be a really useful thing for our legal system and for society. Bias. We worry about bias. The Sixth Amendment says it guarantees you, an impartial jury of your peers. We know it doesn't really guarantee you that. It guarantees you a jury where your lawyers have had a chance to kick off people who they've got some reason to think are partial. But if we could determine whether jurors were biased or not, and it were cheap and easy to do that, people would be interested in doing it. And I would note, for jury purposes, it's not just biased on race, sex, national origin, etc. It's biased against the police or for the police, biased against motorcycle riders or for motorcycle riders, biased in favor of people with white hair, against people with beards. A variety of different biases, and neuroscience might, or might not, but might be able to give us some clues that way. I can even imagine, barely, a very brave lawyer challenging a judge as biased and trying to get a judge into an MRI scanner. Now, that's only a lawyer who's confident he's going to lose that case at trial anyway and is hoping for a good result on appeal. But we could see that could happen. Third, responsibility. This has gotten a lot of attention. I think the most of the attention in this area. It will get some attention in this workshop as well. This is the issue, and one of my neuroscience friends expressed it as, neuroscience will tell us that people don't have free will, and therefore the criminal justice system will dry up and blow away. Now, I think as a prediction about what will happen, that's not very a good prediction. One of the reasons for that is the criminal law has lots of reasons behind it other than just punishing the morally guilty or those who have acted out of free will. Free will is not something you have to prove as a prosecutor in order to get a conviction. So I think it actually will not be as revolutionary as some people expect, but there will be roles for it around the edges. Some of those will be evidentiary. Imagine somebody who's making an insanity defense who claims he has hallucinations. You wonder, does he really have hallucinations? Put him in a scanner. You may be able to see whether he's showing signs of visual hallucinations by activation in his visual cortex, or auditory hallucinations by activations in his auditory cortex. It may be evidence that could be useful. More broadly, I think there may be a few cases, I don't think there'll be many, when neuroscience evidence helps convince us that somebody really couldn't help himself from acting. It's unclear how much of a defense that is in the backlash to Durham, how strong a defense that is today. But if we really were confident that somebody couldn't help himself, would we punish him criminally? The anecdote about this that I find powerful is one from a case in Virginia. A high school teacher in his early 40s, normal background, suddenly gets interested in pornography. His interest grows. He starts downloading child pornography, and then he misbehaves with his 12-year-old stepdaughter. I think, not grossly, though it's hard to tell, but it was gross enough that she told her mother, the mother told the police, the guy pleaded guilty. It was his first offense. They said, go through this sex diversion program. If you pass it, we'll put you on probation, we won't send you to prison. And he certainly didn't want to go to prison. Prison is not a good place for anyone, and especially not for pedophiles. Other prisoners don't like them, guards don't like them. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. So he's trying to stay out of prison, but he fails the diversion program miserably. He's propositioning man, woman, child, animal, mineral, vegetable. But he's told, you flunked out. On Wednesday, you're going to go back to court. You'll be sentenced to prison. On Tuesday, he complained of terrible headaches. They thought he was faking. He couldn't write very well. They thought he was faking. He was urinating without apparent control. They thought he was faking, but he complained so much they took him to the ER, they did a CT scan, and he had a tumor in his left frontal lobe the size of a chicken's egg. A hemangioma, so not a brain tumor exactly, but a tumor in the blood system that was pressing on the brain. Surgery was done, was successful. He said, I don't have those urges anymore. Went through the diversion program, passed it with flying colors, was released on probation, spent 10 months with his family, told his probation officer, I'm getting those urges again. Probation officer did not take him back to court, took him back to the ER. Tumor had grown back. They took the tumor out a second time, and for the 2 years for which we have follow-up, he reported being impulse-free and he was crime-free, at least detected crime-free. Should he have been guilty of pedophilia, or should the tumor in his brain have been guilty of pedophilia? And what should we do in that case? Now, saying that maybe we should have a criminal exception in those cases where we're really confident, and there will be few cases where we can be that confident. This guy was his own case in control twice. May or may not, whether that should be an exception may or may not be agreed to. It also may or may not be the case that being an exception is a good thing. If we couldn't do the surgery, we might not convict him criminally, but we might put him away in an institution for the rest of his life for longer than his criminal sentence. But I think there will be a few cases, only a handful, where neuroscience will really push us on some criminal cases about responsibility. Category 4, consciousness. An amazing paper came out in February of last year from Adrian Owen and Stephen Lauries at Cambridge and the University of Liège, looking at patients who were in a persistent vegetative state, a vegetative state, or a minimally conscious state. They looked at 54 patients. They found that 5 of them had brains that responded in the scanner to being talked to about certain things, about playing tennis or about walking through their homes or their local streets. The brains were activated in had slightly greater ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated hemoglobin, something I suspect you'll hear more about later, but were working in areas, the secondary motor area for tennis, the parahippocampal gyrus for the navigation task, that you would expect activation for people, conscious people who heard that. But these people had no signs of consciousness. They were unresponsive. That was interesting. Then they took one of those people, somebody who had been diagnosed in a persistent vegetative state for 5 years, and did yes-no questions. Was your father's name Alexander? If the answer is yes, think about playing tennis. If the answer is no, think about walking through your house. Do you have any brothers? If the answer is yes, think about walking through your house. If the answer is no, think about playing tennis. 6 yes-no questions. He answered the first 5 perfectly. The 6th, there was no answer. We don't know. Was he asleep? Had he fallen unconscious? Was he bored? Was the answer sort of, maybe? I'm not sure. We don't know. But it's pretty hard to look at that and not think that that guy was conscious, even though he had shown no response to any outside stimuli, no bedside response for 5 years. What do you do with that? It's a legal question, to some extent, for end-of-life care. It's a real tough question for patients and neurologists and others occasionally. I've had people both at the University of Virginia, neurologists at both the University of Virginia and Stanford, tell me they've had family members who've heard about this ask to have their loved ones scanned as a result, wanting that information. Although which way that information would cut isn't entirely clear to me. Would you be more likely to pull the plug, in the vulgar metaphor, for somebody who was permanently unconscious and not perceiving things, or for somebody who was conscious and couldn't interact, who was in kind of the world's worst solitary confinement? What would we do? Someday, judges may have to answer those questions. And certainly ethics committees at hospitals and others will have to answer questions like that. Category 5, treatment. Treatment is the point of all this research. The NIH isn't funding all this research so that my neuroscience friends can discover cool new stuff. Although they're happy that they discover cool new stuff, but they want them to discover cool new stuff that will affect human disease, that will help prevent human disease or treat it or cure it. And that would be wonderful. But they also may be able to treat some other things. In 1949, Egas Muniz, a Portuguese neurologist, won the Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology for his invention of a procedure that later, somewhat modified, came to be called the prefrontal lobotomy. 20 years later, it was reviled widely as barbaric and abandoned. It was accepted and used widely, far more widely than the initial indications, and did some great damage. I am confident, though I have not been able to find a record of this, that some district attorney somewhere in the United States, among the 30,000 Americans who were lobotomized between the late 30s and the early 60s, said, you know, this 19-year-old, he did this thing wrong. We've got him dead to rights on this criminal conviction, but he's not right in the mind. Parents, if you have him lobotomized, we won't charge him. There's a treatment for criminal behavior. At least 2 publications have talked about neurosurgery to treat opiate addiction. A Chinese group burned out the nucleus accumbens in People's Liberation Army soldiers who were addicted to heroin. They reported in an English language peer-reviewed publication that afterwards the soldiers no longer craved heroin. Didn't say what else they no longer craved. A Russian hospital did surgery in the cingulate gyrus and similarly reported success in curing the addiction. But at what cost? This is not just hypothetical. You are sitting in a state that requires people convicted of certain crimes to undergo brain interventions. If you're convicted in California or 7 other states of certain sex crimes and you're male, you're sentenced to chemical castration. High doses of an FDA-approved contraceptive called Depo-Provera, which inhibits your brain's and body's responses to testosterone. Some people for whom it works report they no longer think about sex, they don't care about it, they used to be obsessed, now they just don't care. Sounds like a good thing? Problem is, we don't have very many studies or very good studies about whether it's effective. A handful of studies with N's in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, and with recidivism rates between 3% and 80%. Second, we don't know whether it's safe. Now, it's an FDA-approved contraceptive for women, but it carries a black box warning now for women because it's associated with bone demineralization and maybe in the long term with osteoporosis. What are its effects on the bones of men? We don't have a clue. Nobody did clinical trials on this on men when the FDA was approving it as a female contraceptive. The men are getting it at 8 to 40 times the rate, the dose that women are getting it for contraceptive purposes. Are we turning their bones to dust? We don't know. And they're sex offenders. We don't care. So there may be ways in which society wants to use neuroscience techniques to intervene, to treat things we don't like. We have to worry, are they safe and effective or not? And if they are safe and effective, do we have a right to do that? Should we be able to change somebody's brain with surgery? Now, I actually am more agnostic on the second point than my tone of voice may make it sound. Sending somebody to prison changes their brain in a very drastic way. Everything changes our brains. If you remember tomorrow you were here today, it's because we changed your brain. So is prison changing the brain morally different than doing it with a knife or a drug or an electrode? I don't know, but we may have to answer that question. Last issue, enhancement. How many of you regularly use chemical, pharmacological, cognitive enhancers? And the rest of you are probably lying. Caffeine. How many of you use caffeine? Okay, I certainly. Where is my caffeine? I could use some more. We use things to enhance various aspects of our cognition. I'd even argue that alcohol enhances some parts of our cognitive abilities, like sociability, for a little while at least. And probably Adderall, Ritalin, and caffeine also have some bad sides as well as some good sides. We use these things in most recent survey I've seen of college students, this is from a 1,600-person survey at the University of Kentucky, 4% of those students reported that they had prescriptions for Adderall and Ritalin and had used them in college. 34% of the students said they didn't have a prescription but had used Adderall or Ritalin in college to help them study. That is a federal and state crime, using a controlled substance from somebody else's prescription. They said, hey, how can it be wrong? I was using it to help me study. Of the juniors and seniors, it was over 50%. Of the Greeks, which doesn't mean people from Athens, but means people in fraternities and sororities, it was over 70%. Oddly, I think the stereotype is it's the A student going for the A+. University of Kentucky, it was a C- student trying to avoid the D or the F. But it's widely used. And this isn't even a particularly good drug. It doesn't do that much, and it has some serious side effects, some serious potential risks. What if we get good cognitive enhancers? What if some of the billions of dollars being spent to come up with treatments for memory impairments actually work? And turn out not to just work on people with Alzheimer's or people like me who have what they hope is age-appropriate memory impairment, but they also work on 22-year-olds, 25-year-olds taking the bar exam, or college sophomores studying organic chemistry, the bizarre gateway to medical school in the American system, and help them memorize things better. Do we drug test them? Do we make them pee in a cup before they take the exam? That'd be great in the bar exam. Do we subsidize the pills? Do we try to restrict the pills? What do? We know we know what's happened in sport, where people use enhancing drugs regularly, and there's a great uproar and furor about it, and yet the fans continue to watch, and it's not clear that anything actually changes other than that you move from one drug to another harder to detect drug and another harder to detect drug. What about brains? Is that different? So, you will have noticed I've asked a lot of questions. I haven't had a lot of answers. I could go on for hours and hours, and that's days and days, and that's probably literally the truth, but I won't. I think there are a lot of ways in which neuroscience is likely to affect the law. I've enumerated some of them. Some of the things I've speculated on won't come to pass. Some things I haven't speculated on either because I didn't have time or because I don't have a clue about them will come to pass. I don't know which is which. But I am confident neuroscience will have a major effect on the law, both the law's processes, the subjects of the law, and ultimately, to the extent it changes our understandings of ourselves, our brains, our functioning, the culture that gives rise to the law and that the law in turn influences. Thanks for your attention. I'll be happy to try and answer any questions. I'll be happy not to answer any questions. I'll be less happy not to answer any questions. Come on.
I'm a neuroscientist, so
Yeah.
one has a sense that in talking about imagining possibilities and asking questions, it almost encourages a magical view of what neuroscience is possibly able to do. I'll give an example in terms of lie detection, in terms of asking the questions if somebody remembers a particular object. But when we do experiments like that, we give 100 pictures, we then give 200 pictures, and we average all the data together in order to see a difference in the brain which can be detected between a novel and familiar object. Mm-hmm. The idea of detecting familiarity for a single object is something we can scarcely imagine.
Well, you might want to talk with my colleague Anthony Wagner here in the room, who's recently published some fMRI memory work. I'm sure he would not disagree with you broadly, but would probably disagree with you around the margins. Things are getting, well, first, yes, it's very easy to fall into an exaggerated view of what this science can do, in part because it's so cool, in part because the public relations offices of universities, when a scientist comes out with a paper, love to spin the highest and most exciting and speculative results of it. And this issue of going from groups to individuals is a particularly big issue, a particularly big concern, and one that actually the MacArthur Project has, the Law and Neuroscience Project, has thought about looking into in more detail. I can only say that I think there is at least some plausible peer-reviewed scientific support for everything I've said, and that as our techniques get better, particularly some of our statistical techniques, our power in being able to reach that a useful strength of prediction on the individual case may get fairly strong in some circumstances, but certainly not in all of them. But as a cautionary note, that's really important. It's really important for all of us lawyers here to remember that it's easy for us to get caught up and excited. It's easy for us to find neuroscientists who get caught up in their own work and get a little excited, and particularly in talking to people who aren't fellow neuroscientists. It's really important to listen to the limitations.
Maybe I'll maybe I'll just chime in on this and see.
Speak a little louder.
I'm not sure.
Maybe standing up.
Anthony always needs to speak louder. He's a quiet guy.
That's a useful feature here. So this issue of going from group to individual, either at the question level or the item level, which is in essence your point, actually did come up in the Semrau case, which I believe Steve Lincoln made reference to, where there, my understanding is one of the issues that the judge made in trying to determine whether or not the CFO's report on Semrau's statement on whether it was mine or not. One thing that the judge sort of weighed in on as well, the statements about accuracy or truth telling versus not at the group level, and that there could be a statement about these particular questions, and perhaps Lake will have a chance to sort of comment on that. But that is a very fair point. I think already sort of seen it incorporate this issue of being able to make statements at the individual question level or item level.
Individual and item.
Right, exactly. And then as Hank noted, I'll try to comment on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that this group to individual is a big deal. The ecological realism of the tests, controlled, usually undergrads paid to be in an experiment. How well does that translate to the real world is a big deal. Countermeasures is a big deal if I'm trying to fake that I'm in pain. And I remember in great detail my 2 kidney stones. What will I look like? All these are hard, open questions, and all these are things that have to be taken into account when you decide whether something actually works and how well it works.
Right there and then. Go ahead, right here.
Hello? Anyway, so I'm a neuroscientist, and I understand the warnings to sort of be careful with the data and whatnot. The field, though, has a kind of momentum of enthusiasm of late, let's say the last 10 years, that has accrued because stuff that we only dreamed about doing in animals, and it's really hard to talk to an animal or worry over complex mental states of an animal, are now being made available to us in human beings. It's hard not to get excited about that. And while I understand Larry's issue, because I work in the area, I actually see this as being very intrusive very soon. The ability to tell whether or not you're lying, or to tell whether or not you're being deceptive in one way or another, it's sort of just intruding on your thoughts, basically. I think the technology will evolve again in the next 10 years so that the people in here that don't have gray hair will be dealing with these issues squarely, I think, before 2015, 2020. That
Some of us with gray hair hope to still be around, but...
Okay. See, right then, I skipped the temptation to say something. In the future, you'll know that. So, what I wanted you to comment on, because I think you have a particularly clear point of view on this, is how the law, that you guys see it preventing the intrusiveness of all this. Because, in fact, the ideas of civil liberties, protecting them, protecting people who can't protect themselves, for example, children, and the thoughts that children may have. So children are being brought into this wholesale because we really want to know how these capacities develop, how they come online, how mental capacity, how variable they are across children, and we want to know things about what pathological cases. So in fact, how do we, it seems to me the protections against this are going to be the big legal issue coming up, not the few people that commit heinous crimes.
And you know, we want to know things about kids for very good and moral reasons of wanting to help them. We'd like to be able to know more about dyslexia in order to help kids with which can be very disabling socially disabling problem of dyslexia, but you start taking brain scans of 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds. There's a lot of information in there. I think this is a big issue. There's been some thought about how this would fit into our constitutional framework. Now, the U.S. constitutional framework is something lawyers love to think about, even though the Constitution only applies to government actions. It doesn't apply to, for the most part, it doesn't apply to individuals' actions or corporations' actions. And it may not do all that much. People have thought about the Fifth Amendment implications, the Fourth Amendment search and seizure implications. Nita Farahani at Vanderbilt is doing some work on this, and she's convinced me that although sympathetic judges could find things in those amendments, more likely those amendments will not provide sufficient protection, and we probably need some sort of legislation or even arguably a constitutional amendment, although that's probably never going to happen, to protect some aspects of cognitive liberty. But it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a very difficult way to get through. I hope that we will muddle through. Muddle through is, I think, the best we can hope to do, because we're going to be, for the next several decades, in a period where we're not sure really how good these things are and aren't, where we're balancing the potential benefits we see from them, usually perceived both by the people who like the benefits and the people who hope to benefit from them as being more likely than they probably actually are, against the risks, which will also be by some people poo-pooed and some people exaggerated. Both the benefits and the risks will be murky numbers, murky things, hard to weigh and assess. I think we're going to have a lot of trouble with this. I do think we probably need some sort of statutory protections. What shape those should take is not very clear to me. How politically to get from here to there is definitely unclear. Unfortunately, one of the strongest ways to get legislation to protect things is to have a terrible scandal where things have been abused. And it may be that we need the equivalent of the lobotomy to lead to useful protections here. I hope not. And I hope conferences like this and other work and thinking at this intersection area can help us come up with a way to answer both questions. When is it good enough, and how should we use it once it's good enough, in ways that maximize the benefits of the technologies and minimize its harms? A long answer of I don't really know.
Hank, when it was announced many years ago that we were going to start mapping the human genome, people were very optimistic about our ability to predict disease and behavior and so forth from genetic markers. And I think there's growing consensus that that project has not led to the kind of predictions that people thought it was going to be able to lead to. And one of the reasons is the discovery that that genes are that gene expression is affected by the context in which it takes place.
That environment plays a role.
Right. And one of the things that I think is missing from a lot of the discussion of neuroscience and the law is context. Because people can have very similar neuroprofiles and behave in very different ways because they're in different environments. And I'm wondering if you might comment about whether anybody is thinking about that and discussing that in the context of neuroscience and the law.
Some, probably not enough. Just in one very specific example, when people worry about the ecological realism of some of the experiments that have been done in lie detection and other things, they're really worrying in part about context. If you can see something with a 22-year-old undergraduate who's getting $50 to be in a research project and is, quote, lying, close quote, when he's following the instructions he has been given, how realistic is that in the context of somebody on the witness stand saying, no, I didn't try to buy cocaine from that undercover officer? Or me saying to my mom on Thanksgiving, no, the turkey wasn't too dry, it was wonderful, as always. So there is some interest in that. I think there needs to be more attention paid to it. I do think, though, it's a little bit different from genes in a way that makes the neuroscience both more interesting and ultimately more, I think, makes it plausible that it may have a bigger effect, although the genetics effect is non-trivial. And that is that the brain is the sum of both the environment and the genetics. It is constantly changing in response to the environment. My MAOA gene, which I got from my mother because it's on the X chromosome 59 years ago, hasn't changed, although its expression status has changed, but my brain is changing constantly. And I think I may, it's at least attractive to think, that I may be able to predict things better with my current brain about my future behavior in some contexts than by looking at what alleles I received many, many years ago. So yes, it's an appropriate concern. We're not paying as much attention to it as I think we should, but there is attention paid to it. And I do think neuroscience there's reason to think that it is more promising than just genetics.
We have time for one more question.
So I think the little defensive neuroscientist in me is going to speak now. So neuroscience, the assumption is that your brain causes all your behaviors. And yes, context, the environment has something to do with it, and yes, some subjects lie, but we do have many findings that replicate really well study after study across many subjects in many different ways. And my second now question, maybe this is way too much in the future, and maybe it's too science fiction right now, but that's not a good reason to stop the enthusiasm that you talked about just a minute ago. Do you see neuroimaging in the future, maybe not during my lifetime, being kind of like DNA testing in the courtroom?
So to your first point, I certainly agree. There are lots of things where neuroscience is very powerful, highly replicable, I almost fell into genetic language, highly penetrant, where you know if you've got X, Y follows almost inevitably. How big that almost is may turn out to be a big deal in the law in terms of group to individual. But on the second point, my best answer is I don't know. It depends. I don't think it will turn out to be a huge issue with respect to criminal responsibility. I think, and you'll hear this from some people later in this conference, I think the law's view of criminal responsibility is ultimately not going to be changed very much by neuroscience. I think some of these mind reading and evidentiary areas have much more potential. I also think that it's not just an issue of the science, but of the technology. If you have to put somebody in an MRI where they have to stay still and cooperate for an hour, and you have to pay those prices, that's a rate limiting factor. If you could do it with an EEG, or if even better or worse, depending on your perspective, you could do it surreptitiously or at a distance, maybe something with near-infrared laser spectroscopy or something else, and it's cheap and it's easy, that changes the equation. It reminds me actually of automobiles. In 1900, there were about 10,000 cars in the world, and they were an interesting curiosity. Right now, neuroimaging is an interesting curiosity in the law, I think. Really interesting, but not common. By 2000, there were 500 million cars in the world, and they had literally changed the planet. Will we get there with neuroscience? Maybe, but it requires both that there be things that the law really cares about that it can tell us with enough confidence that we want to use, and secondly, that we can do it in a cheap, easy, risk-free, in a convenient enough manner that it can be widely adopted. And both of those are up in the air. My guess is the answer to both of those will be yes, but it's only a guess. It's always hard to predict things, especially the future. Actually, that's not Yogi Berra, despite the fact that he usually gets attributed that. It was probably Niels Bohr, the Danish second baseman, physicist. And I love the quote, but it's wrong. It's easy to predict things. It's just hard to be right about them. And that's something we all need to remember.
Thank you very much.